Hello, everybody. Thank you, Rigo. And as you said, I am Charlie Moreton. I'm a customer success specialist for U.S. commercial here at Cisco. Today, we're going to be talking about on-premise deployment and some of the different platforms and methods that we can use to be able to deploy ISE. All right, so we're going to go through platforms, a few different methods, and what I'd like to talk about first are, even though we won't be talking about cloud deployments in this webinar, I have them on this slide to show that it doesn't matter how you deploy your ISE nodes, whether they're appliances, VM, cloud deployment, or a mix of all three. Just so the hardware allocated is reserved to the VM of the same size Cisco appliance, there will be no difference in performance between those platforms. So you can have your admin nodes in the cloud and PSNs in virtual machines and appliances, or a mix of all three. It doesn't really matter. Now, what are those hardware allocation needs? Those are shown in this table here. We base our hardware allocations on the SNS appliances for ISE. And that all depends on the size and scale of your deployment, which Thomas Howard discussed in our last webinar. So based upon how you're scaling your deployment, you use the appropriate size appliance and hardware allocations from this chart. Now, notice that the 3500 series is end of life, although ISE 3.0 still supports all the 3500 series. ISE 3.1 does not support the 3515, which also means that a VM with that same hardware is not going to be supported in ISE 3.1. So what are some of the pros and cons of appliances versus VMs? Well, with the appliance, you have your dedicated hardware resource, and you know who the clear owner is of all of that. You don't have to worry about which department owns what. They're static resources that everybody knows. With the virtual machines, you have a nice rapid deployment. You can just spin up a virtual machine and send that out as quickly as you can, just so you have the compute and storage resources available. Now, some of the bad things about the appliance is that you have to rack and stack every single one of them. It takes a lot of labor to get it all up and ready and connected for you to use. Spinning hard drives, no SSDs, and the ordering and the shipment fulfillment can be an issue, as we've seen lately with all of the delays in shipping anything that you order, whether it's Amazon or anything like that. Some of the cons for the VMs is that a lot of virtual administrators have a propensity to not want to reserve all of the CPU and RAM necessary for ISE. Then you also have your cross-departmental politics that go into some of that as well. So we're going to start talking with the SNS appliances that you have physical access to. One of the biggest questions that we get is, what is the difference between a UCS server and an SNS appliance? The biggest difference is honestly the UEFI support for secure boot. Now, if you try to install ISE from an ISO onto an SNS server, then it goes through without a problem. And as you see here, you get the setup prompt and you can install ISE. If you try to install ISE from an ISO onto a UCS server, you're going to get an unsupported hardware detected error, and it's going to exit the installation. So that just shows that you need to have a secure boot feature with UEFI and a Cisco signed ISO to be able to install onto an SNS. It just helps to keep your platform secure. Now, if you have the physical access to the server and you want to install ISE, quick, easy way to do it is to create a bootable USB, and you can download the live USB creator to your local system, as well as the ISE Installation ISO. Recommend you use a 16 gig or larger USB device for this. And if you go into the ISE installation guide, go to the additional installation information chapter, the whole scenario is detailed step by step on how to create this. I'm sure that most everybody on this call has already installed something by creating a USB bootable drive anyway, so this should not be unfamiliar to most everybody here. But next, sticking with the SNS servers, we're going to be talking about the Cisco Integrated Management Controller. We call that the CIMC, and that's likely how I'll be talking about it in this webinar. So the biggest thing is just make sure that your CIMC is connected to your network, and just look in your installation guide for whichever SNS server you have, look for the port that's labeled the dedicated management port, and that's how you'll configure your CIMC. Now, as soon as you turn on your server, you're going to get your configuration screen here. And there are a couple ways of configuring the CIMC, whether you do it through the firmware by pressing F8 and going into the CIMC setup, or there's also a web GUI that you can use to configure the controller. Now, at the bottom of the screen, you can see where it says the CIMC IP4 address. If you have DHCP on the subnet through which your management controller is plugged in, you'll get an IP address here. If you don't get an IP address here, it also shows you a MAC address so that you can go into your IP address management system and assign an IP address to that MAC address. Now, if you do choose to press F8 and configure your controller through the firmware, you're going to get this screen here where you can set your IP address and everything that you need to be able to connect to your controller. If you do press F1, you can select a host name and choose whatever you want to name your controller. Once you do save, you have to wait 45 seconds before you restart or refresh for the settings to take effect. If you decide that you do want to configure your controller through the web interface, then you can see that both screens of the firmware configuration are actually shown on this one screen of the web interface. Now, the web interface does allow some advanced configuration of the CIMC, where you can detail some IP access management through the network security tab here, and you can also specify NTP servers. All right, so now that you got your CIMC configured, let's add the ISE 3.1 ISO as virtual media. And we're going to do that under remote management and virtual media. If you add a new mapping, you can map to a local ISO on your computer, and it'll upload it to the controller. Once you have your ISO mapped, you can go up and power cycle your host, and then you launch your KVM. When you launch your KVM, choose the HTML-based KVM. It's a lot easier to use. It's more lightweight client. And in the newer versions of the firmware for CIMC, you don't even have a choice for the Java-based anymore. They've taken that away. So just go ahead and get used to that HTML-based KVM. And once you launch that console, you're going to get this in a window. And as you can see, it boots straight to the ISO, and it gives you your installation options. To watch the installation through the vKVM console, choose your first option to install it through your keyboard and monitor. Once the ISO portion of the installation finishes, we will be prompted to run the setup script by typing setup and entering the details of our ISE node, including a host name, IP address, network mask, default gateway, DNS, and all of that. Once that finishes, we'll be able to go in to the web GUI and do our advanced configurations from the web GUI. So from here, we're going to talk about the virtual machines and the different hypervisors and ways that we can install ISE on virtual machines. So first, what I want to know is, which hypervisor do you plan to use for ISE? Now, we've got 4 different hypervisors that we do support for ISE: VMware vCenter, Hyper-V, Linux KVM, and Nutanix Acropolis, which is the newest hypervisor that we do support. Or are you just going to go SNS all the way? Some people want to do appliances all the way, and that's perfectly fine. Totally happy with that. So while you guys are answering that, I'm going to talk real quick about the hypervisors that we support. Now, these are type 1 hypervisors, and what that means is that a type 1 hypervisor is one that runs on a bare metal server, not over top an underlying operating system. So VMware is a premium product and is the market leader. It's the virtual platform onto which ISE is installed the most. Nutanix is a hypervisor for which we have installed or received a lot of requests for support, and we've added that support with 3.0 and newer. So for those two reasons, we're going to be focusing on these platforms in the webinar. And how do we know that these are the market leader with VMware and that has the most ISE installs out of all the four hypervisors and that people are clamoring for Nutanix support? It's because we ask these questions in webinars just like this. So now that we've asked that question, hopefully we've had a little bit of time for people to respond. And Rigo, do we have any um, responses back from the people?
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. Absolutely. So as a reminder, the question was, which hypervisor do you plan to use for ISE? And wow, well, it actually looks like VMware vCenter is the clear winner here with the overwhelming number of votes. But I also see some participants said none, SNS all the way. So that's our next top answer. But then that's also followed by those who plan to use Microsoft Hyper-V.
Okay. Yep, those all make total sense. Microsoft is another big player in the hypervisor realm, so sounds great. So when we're talking about VMware vCenter, of course, with it being such a big adoption rate, there are multiple ways to deploy a virtual machine to VMware. We're going to talk through four different ways of deployment, including just using the ISO file on your local computer. So we're going to talk about that next. So the first of the two methods by using ISO, of course, is using the one on your local machine. And if you're installing a single virtual machine, you can use the local ISO option, which will allow you to map the ISO image from that local PC to the virtual machine when creating the VM. You would right click on your host, and then you choose new virtual machine. Once you name the machine, select the compute and storage resources, you'll get to the customized hardware screen. Now, in the new CD and DVD drive, client device is the default option, and that's going to allow you to choose your local ISO. So once a VM is created, you open a console for that VM, and then on the console menu, you right-click the disk icon and select Connect Disk Image File to choose your local ISO file. And this will boot to that virtual CD-ROM drive, giving you the same installation options that we saw from the CIMC method. Now, going back a couple steps to the new virtual machine and the new CD drive, there's a more efficient way of installing ISE using an ISO file, and that's to upload the ISO file to the data center for vCenter, and then you can point multiple VMs to use that same ISO file. And since it's local to the VM infrastructure, the transfer time is much shorter, and this is the go-to method for multiple VM installations. So when you are at the customized hardware screen when you're creating your new VM, choose Datastore ISO file, and then enable the Connect at Power On button as well so that it's automatically connected when you launch your virtual machine. So when you do open your console, it will boot again to the installation screen asking you which install that you want to do. Now, Cisco has also made VMware deployments easy by allowing you to leverage pre-packaged ISE virtual machines. Now, these are the OVA files that you see at software.cisco.com, and they're uploaded with different size options based on the SNS platforms that we saw in the earlier slide. And they give recommendations for the node role based upon the OVA that you choose. So we're going to take a quick demo to show how to do the OVA import process. It's sped up a little bit just because we don't have, a ton of time in this webinar, but I'll show you what you need to do. First, you right-click the host and choose Deploy OVF Template. Choose Local File. Then you choose the file to select the VM. Then you name the VM, of course. I type quickly. choose your compute resource, your VM size, and then your storage resource, and click Finish. Once the VM finishes uploading, you can power it on, and you'll be at the setup prompt ready to go through your setup configuration. So that's one way of using the OVA to deploy ISE. The other way is actually through a command line tool that you can download from VMware. It's called the OVFTool. Now you saw everything that we had to go through to be able to deploy that OVA. We had to give it a name. We had to choose the size. We had to choose the network, data store, tell it where the VM was. So we're going to gather all that information and we're going to create a checklist here. And this is what it's going to look like. So one thing that I want to point out is that if you use the @ symbol in your username, such as I do with the vSphere.local domain, you need to use the encoded %40 for the command to work, because OVFTool sees the @ symbol as the beginning of the vCenter address, and it'll give you an error and fail at this point if you don't format it in this way. So once you have this information gathered, use this information to go ahead and you build your OVFTool command that will deploy that OVA file to your vCenter and the host that you specify. Now, I like to stage this command in Notepad, which makes it a quick way to copy and paste. And then I can also change the VM name and IP address so I can deploy a few of these virtual machines at a time. So we're going to take a look at what that looks like next. All right, so first, you see that I have the command in Notepad and a command prompt open. So I'll copy the command, paste it into the command prompt, and press enter. Once the OVFTool reaches out to vCenter, you can see the progress percentage in both the recent task pane and in the command prompt window, as well as the VM name shown in the host and clusters pane. Once the progress reaches 100% and shows complete, you can turn on the VM and it will boot into the setup prompt. All right. So those are the 4 ways that we can install ISE in a VM. Now we're going to talk about the Nutanix Community Edition. Now, Community Edition is a free version of Nutanix. It's the Acropolis operating system, and it's built upon free tools that are readily available out there. There is no Nutanix support for this version, but they do have a very active community for support, and I have found it to be very helpful. So Nutanix is only supported on ISE 3.0 and newer, must be installed from an ISO. There's no prepackaged virtual machine for it, and you have to use Nutanix AHV supervisor. There is some extra configuration that you must run on each ISE VM to be able to install ISE in a Nutanix virtual environment. So we're going to take a look real quick at what Nutanix looks like to install an ISO file. So first you upload the ISO file to the image configuration store in Nutanix. Then from the home menu, choose VM, create VM, and you give it a name. Once you give it your name, and like I said, I type lightning quick, so don't let that spin your head. Go ahead and give it your CPU and memory allocations. Then you add a new disk and choose clone from image service, and you choose the ISO image that you've uploaded. Then you go back and add a new disk again to add the hard drive for the ISE server. 300 gigs again is the minimum. And then add a network adapter and click add. And this will create your new virtual machine. Once the virtual machine shows into the list, which takes a moment, of course, then you have to open up your SSH terminal and SSH into the controller virtual machine. Now, these are the commands I was talking about that you have to SSH in and set these commands on every single ISE node that you put into Nutanix. And we're going to talk about these commands in just a moment once we're done with the demo. I just wanted to show you that this is totally necessary so that we can get ISE installed. Now, once those commands are set, we can power on our Nutanix VM. And once it's powered on, we can open up the console and install ISE. Now, we use the VNC console because it gives us a graphical interface that we can use just like we were sitting at the computer. All right, so if you didn't enter those commands to SSH or you just forgot, you'll see this error after you start the installation. And the error is going to say unsupported hardware detected. So all you have to do at this point is turn off the VM, SSH into the controller VM, and enter the commands and turn the VM back on, and it'll fix that issue. Now, the first command that we typed in was a VM serial port create. So we're creating a serial port for the virtual machine. It's not 100% mandatory, but some processes through the ISE install are only logged or viewable to the serial console. So that's there if you want to view those logs. The next command turns off the Hyper-V clock. Nutanix defaults to Hyper-V emulation, and ISE does not like the emulation on top of KVM, and it'll throw the error for unsupported hardware. This third command disables the Hyper-V branding and finishes turning off that Hyper-V emulation. And with those commands together, that will allow ISE to be installed onto your Nutanix virtual environment. So now we're going to start talking about zero-touch provisioning. We can still install ISE the same ways that we did up until this point, but we're going to add a different configuration in so that it makes the provisioning of ISE a lot faster. So zero-touch provisioning, what is that? Well, it's an efficient method of filling in the setup script, allowing you to focus on other tasks while ISE installs. Instead of waiting for the setup prompt to appear, then entering the information manually, ZTP fills this out for you, which means your ISE node is installed and ready for web GUI administration even faster. And in a large multi-node environment, this can save hours in your deployment. The most common use for ZTP will be using the ISO and image file mount process, as it is supported on much more platforms. VMware and AWS have native APIs that we can leverage for ZTP, and we'll explore the vCenter configuration for those native APIs. But first, we will take a look at the ISO and image file mount option. Now, ZTP is only supported in ISE 3.1 and newer. And since this is a Linux shell script, this is where the need for a Linux machine comes in. Now, this script is taken straight from the ISE installation guide. So copy it exactly how it is and paste it into a text editor on your Linux box. These are the supported Linux distributions that can be used with this script. And this is how we're going to create our shell script. Once we have that on our Linux box, we need to have our configuration. So we're going to create another checklist of the information needed to create this configuration file. Now, once you have this information, you're almost ready. You got to get your host names, your IP addresses, name servers, NTV servers, all of that. But we do have a few tricks up our sleeve. You can see that we can specify a repository to be used. But why would we need that repository? Well, it's because you can use this configuration to install a patch to your installation after the installation script runs and before the final reboot. But not only that, you can also install hot patches after the patch installs, which means you can install a log4j hot patch before you're even ready to use ISE. But wait, we've got even more. You can enable certain services through this configuration as well. The really great part about this configuration file is that you can change the host name and IP address in the file. to match your deployment design, have all your configurations ready to go, including the patch you need, which means that you don't have to wait for ISE to reboot, start all services, install a patch, restart, and then start that process over and over for every single node. It's all done at the same time with one single reboot. Stay to the end of this webinar for the demo to see how we verify that all these services were in fact enabled, because we're going to show that as well. So you take this configuration file and you paste this into a text editor in your Linux distro as well. So we need to create this image file that ISE is going to use for the installation to be able to leverage this. So we open Nano on the Linux box and paste that first shell script into Nano. Save that as create ZTP image.sh, and then we make that sh file executable by using the chmod command that you see. Then we open Nano again and paste in the configuration file with all the IP address information, the patches, hot patches, and all of that. And then you can save that configuration file as any file name that we want. So you can save it for the host name that you're creating the image file for. So we save that as the conf file, conf. And then we can create that image file. So that last command that you see here, you have to have root or sudo privileges to be able to create this image file and mount the images correctly to be able to get your output.img. Just make sure that that conf file references the same file name that you saved your conf file as. Once you have all of your image files for all of your nodes, you're ready to install ISE. All right, so we can do this through the CIMC on an SNS server. It only works on virtual media, so you can't just plug in USB image file for this. It has to be mapped in the CIMC, and the image file must be mapped before the ISO file. So if you already have an ISO file or something mapped in your virtual media, you have to unmap the file. I choose not to keep the file when it asks. Then I map the image file, then I map the ISO file. Power on and restart the server and open a VM console. And you'll see that the default option is the last option, which is the Cisco ISE installation through ZTP configuration. Once you boot, you could just leave it here, or you can press enter. It'll automatically be selected to boot through ZTP after 150 seconds. And then once the setup prompt appears, you'll briefly see this. So instead of typing setup, it's going to automatically have this path in it, and the setup prompt will fill itself out, and it'll populate all the information that you put into your image file. After the ISE installation finishes, the patch is installed, and then any hot patches will be installed, and the system will reboot. Once it does, and you can log in, you can verify the patch and hot patch installation by typing show version history. This shows both the installed patches and hot patches. Or you could just do a show version, but this only shows the installed patch. It does not show the hot patches that are installed. To add the ZTP image file in firmware, first you upload the image to the Datastore like you do the ISO. Then you right-click your VM and you choose Edit Settings. You can also do this as you create the VM. In the virtual hardware screen, you would add another CD DVD drive using the Add New Device button and select the ISE ZTP image file here. Remember to choose Connected Power On, and if you choose this and you get the little red exclamation, then go ahead and hover over it, and you may have an error that says that the file does not exist. And what that means is that you're using a vCenter version lower than the 6.7 Update 3J. which is the required version to allow an image file to be mapped as an optical drive. So you can either upgrade your VMware, or you can use the VM data, the APIs that we were talking about before, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. So the next thing that you need to do is go click on the VM options, go to boot options, and change your firmware to BIOS for the ZTP process to work correctly. Power on the VM, and the ZTP installation will start after 150 seconds, just like in the previous scenarios. So in Nutanix, what does this look like? Well, you go in and you upload your ZTP image to the image configuration. You upload it as an image file. So when Nutanix sees a .img file extension, it's going to automatically try to save it as an image type disk. And if it does that, it's not going to mount correctly for the ISE ISO to be able to see it, to use it as the image configuration file. Once you have it uploaded, you'll see it with your other ISOs in your repository for the image configuration. And then you can add that as a second drive in your virtual machine. And once you do that, you can power on your virtual machine. ZTP installation will start, and you'll have all of your setup configuration script. And that's how the ZTP image file works for the CIMC firmware, for the VMware, and for Nutanix. Now we're going to talk about the ZTP for VMware native APIs. These are the APIs that VMware has exposed to be able to be used, and it's called VM data. So if you're looking for that, you're looking for VM data. This can be used in vCenter 6.5 and newer, so that we can leverage the ZTP option for those that get the error that we showed on the other screen for the image file does not exist. You can use the VM data. Now, to be able to use it, we need to encode the configuration file to base64 format. So we copy the configuration file from your text editor and paste it into the encoder at base64encode.org. And then in the advanced configuration parameters of your virtual machine, we create a new parameter for guestinfo.ice.ztp and paste the encoded text into the field. I know that's overly simplified. We're going to take a look at it and show you exactly how that works, but it really is that easy. And we'll show that process in this demo from start to finish. So we copy the configuration, we go up to encode, we paste it in, encode, copy the encoded text, right click your VM, VM options, we expand the advanced and scroll down to edit configuration. Click add configuration and enter guestinfo.ice.ztp. Paste the encoded text and click OK. Then we can open the VM console, power on the VM, and watch the script run. Once you get the login prompt, log in to show version history. And you can see that patch 1 was installed, and so was the log4j fix. If we choose to show version, we can see that patch 1 is shown as installed here. Now, show application status ISE until application server is running, and then we can log in to the ISE web GUI. We right-click the gear and go to About ISE and Server, and this shows us that patch information, that patch 1 has been installed. Then we go to Administration, System Settings, API Settings, API Service Settings. And this shows that the ERS and the open API services that we enable through our script have been enabled in the ISE node. Then we can go to the deployment, select our node, and scroll down and verify that both PXGrid and PX Grid Cloud services have been turned on through our configuration script as well. Okay, so I know that was a quick high-level overview of zero-touch provisioning, but if you want to learn more about it, I get real in-depth in talking about zero-touch provisioning at the URL that you see on the screen. If you have any questions, you can post them on that document, or you can reach out to me directly, and we'll work with you and see whatever questions you do have. Now, if you do want to download the OVFTool and use that, which is a fantastic resource, I've got a link here to the user guide, which will allow you to download and install that, as well as some other useful resources for you to use. So, Rigo, do we have any outstanding questions?
All right, that was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much, Charlie. So from what I'm seeing here, it looks like all outstanding questions have been answered. Oh, I spoke too soon because we just had one come in right now. So, question here is: can ISE 3.1 run in a VMware cluster with vMotion and DRS enabled?
vMotion, hot vMotion right now is not supported. Cold vMotion is supported, so you can shut down your VM and then move it to another compute and storage resource. I think that is somewhere on the roadmap to support hot vMotion.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Don't see any other outstanding questions, but we do have a few minutes left. So for our audience, if you have any questions for our presenter, this is a great opportunity for you to ask. Maybe you need clarification about something that was discussed in today's webinar, something about today's topic. You need clarification on something. This is a great opportunity for you to ask right now. So if you do have any additional questions for our panelists, please go ahead and post them in the Q&A chat right now. And then let me see if anything else has come in. So here's another question, Charlie. VM can do thin provisioning on the storage, or can VM do thin provisioning on the storage?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
we do support thin provisioning with ISE VMs.
Perfect. Thank you.
It's suggested that you use the thick provisioning, but you can definitely use the thin provisioning.